The coffee pot trembled slightly in Sergeant First Class Harold Vance's weathered hands as Colonel Bradley's voice cut through the Pentagon conference room. "Just get the old man to pour faster. We don't have all day for his shuffle." The comment drew quiet chuckle from three junior officers seated near the mahogany table's far end, their eyes following Harold's deliberate movements with barely concealed impatience. Harold had heard worse in his 78 years. Much worse. But the casual dismissal still stung as he moved methodically around the polished conference table, filling bone china cups with practiced precision. The morning briefing hadn't officially started, yet the room already buzzed with the particular energy of men convinced of their own importance. Major Patterson leaned back in his leather chair, stage whispering to Captain Morrison beside him. "Think they pulled him from the VA hospital? Look at those shaky hands. Probably hasn't held anything heavier than a coffee pot in decades." Morrison's response came with a smirk that Harold caught in his peripheral vision. "Better than having him attempt real work, I suppose." The Pentagon's executive conference room stretched 40 feet in length, its walls lined with portraits of decorated generals whose stern gazes seemed to witness Harold's quiet humiliation. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the polished table, where classified folders waited in neat stacks, their red covers marking discussions far above a coffee server's security clearance. At least, that's what everyone assumed. General Marcus Thornfield entered with his usual commanding presence, his aide Captain Rodriguez trailing behind with an armload of briefing materials. Thornfield's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces with military efficiency before settling briefly on Harold. "Make sure the civilian stays near the service station," he directed Rodriguez quietly. "We'll be discussing Operation Midnight Eagle today." Before we continue with this important briefing, I want to take a moment to connect with all of you watching. Drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations where veterans weren't given the recognition they deserved in your community. It's more common than we'd like to admit, and your stories matter. Harold positioned himself beside the ornate silver service card, its polished surface reflecting the room's warm lighting. His dress blue uniform, though impeccably maintained, showed signs of age that the younger officers interpreted as evidence of his irrelevance. The fabric held memories of ceremonies these men had only read about in history books, but today it marked him as nothing more than help. Captain Morrison's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at Harold with unconcealed annoyance. "Coffee's getting cold already, Pops. Think you could manage a fresh pot without taking all morning?" The captain's tone carried the particular condescension reserved for those deemed beneath notice, each word carefully chosen to establish hierarchy. "I'll have a fresh pot ready in 5 minutes, sir," Harold replied, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Years of military discipline kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd learned long ago that dignity meant maintaining composure when others abandoned theirs. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes shuffled through his briefing papers, speaking without looking up. "Rodriguez, remind me why we have civilian contractors handling refreshments during classified briefings? Seems like a security risk we could avoid." His comment hung in the air like cigarette smoke, staining the atmosphere with casual cruelty. Captain Rodriguez glanced nervously between his superior and Harold. "Sir, Sergeant Vance has appropriate clearance for refreshment services. He's been assigned to this duty rotation for the past 6 months." The explanation sounded apologetic, as if Harold's presence required justification rather than simple professional courtesy. 6 months of this, Harold thought, watching steam rise from the industrial coffee maker's spout. 6 months of being treated like furniture with legs, of having conversations flow around him as if he lacked ears to hear the dismissive comments. The irony wasn't lost on him that men planning tomorrow's battles couldn't recognize yesterday's heroes standing 3 feet away. The conference room's air conditioning hummed quietly overhead, its cool breeze rustling the classified documents that would determine military policy for the coming quarter. Harold had read similar documents once, had acted on intelligence that shaped the course of conflicts these officers studied in war college textbooks. But today, his security clearance extended only to coffee preparation and silent observation. Major Patterson stretched in his chair, vertebrae popping audibly in the quiet room. "At least the old-timer keeps quiet," he remarked to Captain Morrison. "Last thing we need is some washed-up soldier trying to inject his outdated perspective into modern warfare planning. Some of these old guys think their ancient war stories qualify them to advise current operations." Harold's knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped the coffee pot's handle. Ancient war stories. If only they knew which stories he carried, which classified operations bore his signature, which medals rested in a small wooden box on his apartment dresser. But today wasn't about yesterday's glory. Today was about enduring another morning of being invisible while visible, present while dismissed. The fresh coffee's aroma filled the conference room as Harold completed his second round of service, the rich scent mingling with the leather and wood polish that gave the Pentagon's executive spaces their distinctive atmosphere. General Thornfield had taken his seat at the table's head, his silver eagles catching the overhead lighting as he arranged his briefing materials with characteristic precision. Captain Morrison's voice carried easily across the room as he spoke to Lieutenant Walsh, who had arrived moments earlier with additional classified folders. "You see Grandpa over there?" he said, nodding toward Harold with barely disguised amusement. "Been shuffling around here for months now. Pretty sure he thinks he's still active duty, the way he wears that old uniform." Lieutenant Walsh glanced over, taking in Harold's carefully pressed dress blues with a casual assessment of someone half his age. "Those ribbons look like they're from World War II or something," he replied quietly. "Probably picked them up at some surplus store. You know how these old guys like to play dress-up, pretend they were something special back in the day." Harold's hand remained steady as he filled Lieutenant Walsh's cup, though something cold settled in his stomach. The ribbons on his chest represented more than these young officers would ever comprehend, each colored strip a condensed story of sacrifice they couldn't begin to imagine. But today, those symbols of service had become props in their theater of dismissal. The morning light streaming through the conference room's tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, tiny particles that seemed to move with more purpose than Harold was allowed in this space. He returned to his position beside the service card, hands clasped behind his back in a stance these officers would recognize if they bothered to look closely enough. Major Patterson pulled out his smartphone, scrolling through messages while speaking to Captain Rodriguez. "Amazing what passes for security clearance these days," he said, his voice intentionally loud enough for Harold to hear. "In my day, we wouldn't have random civilians wandering around during classified briefings, even if they're just pouring coffee." "Sir, Sergeant Vance has been thoroughly vetted," Captain Rodriguez replied, though his tone suggested he was growing tired of defending Harold's presence. His background check was more extensive than most contractors we use for support services. The captain's words carried a hint of something the others missed, a subtle emphasis that went unnoticed by men too busy being clever. General Thornfield opened the first briefing folder, his weathered face serious as he scanned the initial pages. The general's silver hair was cropped military short, and his posture spoke of decades spent bearing responsibility for other men's lives. Unlike his subordinates, he seemed focused entirely on the mission at hand rather than the room's peripheral personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward, pointing to a specific paragraph in his briefing materials. "Sir, the intelligence suggests enemy forces have significantly upgraded their defensive capabilities since our last assessment. We're looking at potentially heavy casualties if we proceed with the original operational timeline." Harold had heard similar discussions countless times, though usually from the other side of the table. He knew the weight of decisions that cost lives, the terrible mathematics of warfare, where success was measured in objectives achieved against soldiers lost. These officers spoke of casualties as statistics, but Harold remembered when those numbers had names and faces. Captain Morrison shifted in his seat, accidentally knocking his pen to the floor near Harold's feet. The pen rolled across the polished hardwood, coming to rest against Harold's regulation black shoes. Morrison glanced up with exaggerated annoyance. Think you could grab that for me, Pops? Might as well make yourself useful while you're standing around. Harold bent slowly, his joints protesting the movement in ways that hadn't bothered him 30 years earlier. As he straightened and handed the pen back, Morrison made a show of examining it as if checking for damage. Try not to drop anything yourself, old man, the captain said with a smirk. We can't have you breaking the good china. The casual cruelty hung in the air like smoke from extinguished match. Harold had faced enemy fire, had stared down death itself in jungles these men knew only from satellite imagery. Yet their words cut deeper than shrapnel ever had. There was something particularly painful about being dismissed by those sworn to the same flag he'd bled for. Lieutenant Walsh consulted his tablet, swiping through digital intelligence reports with the casual efficiency of a generation raised on screens. Based on current assessment, he said to the room, our primary concern should be advanced surface war capabilities in the target zone. The enemies learned from previous engagements and adapted accordingly. Previous engagements. Harold almost smiled at the clinical terminology. He'd participated in engagements these officers had studied in tactical school, had written after-action reports that became case studies in modern military doctrine. But standing beside the coffee cart, he was simply an old man whose past was assumed to be unremarkable. General Thornfield's aide entered quietly, carrying additional folders marked with red classification bands. The general looked up from his materials, his sharp eyes conducting another sweep of the room. Rodriguez, he said quietly, I want minimal personnel present for the next portion of this briefing. Anyone without specific operational need should be cleared from the conference room. Captain Rodriguez straightened in his chair. Sir, should I have Sergeant Vance step outside? He's scheduled to maintain refreshment services throughout the morning briefing. The captain's question seemed routine, but Harold detected something else in his tone, a careful neutrality that suggested more knowledge than he was revealing. Major Patterson leaned back with visible satisfaction. Probably for the best, he said loudly enough for Harold to hear clearly. Some of this intelligence is way above civilian pay grade. No offense, Pops, but this isn't exactly coffee shop conversation. His comment drew knowing chuckles from several other officers around the table. Harold began gathering empty cups onto his service tray, each piece of china clicking softly against the others. He'd prepared to leave countless briefings before, though usually because the meeting had concluded rather than because his presence was deemed inappropriate. The familiar weight of exclusion settled across his shoulders like an old coat. The conference room's grandfather clock chimed the half hour, its deep tones reverberating off the wood-paneled walls where portraits of military legends gazed down with expressions of stern judgment. Harold wondered what those decorated heroes would think of this scene, whether they'd recognize the irony of a fellow warrior being dismissed by those who'd never earned the right to question his presence. Harold remained at his position beside the service card as General Thornfield considered Captain Rodriguez's question about clearing the room. The general's weathered fingers drummed once against the polished table surface before he spoke. Let him stay, Thornfield said finally. Coffee service continues regardless of classification level. Just ensure he understands the sensitivity of what he might overhear. The dismissive assumption that Harold lacked the intelligence or discretion to handle classified information settled over the room like a familiar fog. Major Patterson exchanged a meaningful glance with Captain Morrison, both men clearly amused by the general's decision to treat the coffee server as a potential security risk rather than simply asking him to leave. Captain Rodriguez opened the first red band folder, his voice taking on the formal tone reserved for classified briefings. Sir, Operation Midnight Eagle involves a high-value target extraction in the Kandahar province. Intelligence suggests enemy forces have established a sophisticated defensive perimeter using tactics we haven't encountered in previous operations. Harold's hands remained steady as he organized the coffee service, but his mind sharpened with the familiar focus of operational planning. Kandahar province. He knew that terrain better than these officers knew their own neighborhoods. had walked those mountain paths when their current war college textbooks were still being written by men who'd never seen combat. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward, studying satellite imagery spread across the table's surface. "The extraction window is extremely narrow," he said, pointing to specific coordinates on the photographs. "We're looking at a 12-hour maximum before enemy reinforcements arrive from this base here. Any delay means potential loss of the entire strike team." The photographs showed terrain Harold recognized from missions these officers had only read about in classified historical documents. He'd been there when those valleys were first mapped for military purposes, when the intelligence networks that still fed current operations were initially established. But today, his presence was tolerated only because someone needed to refill coffee cups. Captain Morrison consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be personnel files. "Sir, we're recommending Lieutenant Hendricks lead the extraction team. He has extensive experience in similar terrain and has successfully completed 4 high-value target missions in the past 18 months. Morrison's confidence seemed designed to impress the general with his thorough preparation. General Thornfield studied the personnel recommendations with the careful attention of a commander who understood that names on paper translated to real lives in dangerous places. His questions came sharp and precise. What's Hendricks' experience with hostile extractions under heavy fire? Has he operated in this specific region before? Harold knew the answers to those questions better than anyone in the room, though his knowledge came from a different perspective entirely. He'd trained some of the officers who'd trained Lieutenant Hendricks, had established many of the tactical protocols still used for operations in that exact region. But standing beside the coffee cart, his expertise was as invisible as his service record. Major Patterson cleared his throat, drawing attention to another section of the briefing materials. "Sir, our primary concern is enemy familiarity with our standard operating procedures. They seem to anticipate our tactical approaches, almost as if they're working from our own playbook. It's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain operational surprise." The irony struck Harold with unexpected force. These officers were discussing an enemy that had learned American tactics so thoroughly they could predict operational patterns, yet they couldn't recognize one of the men who'd written those very tactics standing 3 feet away. The enemy showed more respect for his legacy than his own military did. Lieutenant Walsh consulted a different set of photographs, these showing what appeared to be improvised defensive positions. Based on reconnaissance imagery, he said, enemy forces have constructed overlapping fields of fire that neutralize our standard approach vectors. We'll need to develop alternative insertion methods if we hope to maintain mission effectiveness. Harold had faced similar defensive configurations decades earlier, had developed some of the countermeasures these officers were now trying to reinvent. The solutions existed in classified after-action reports he'd written, filed away in Pentagon archives that no one bothered to consult because they were authored by someone currently serving coffee. General Thornfield's aide returned with additional intelligence folders, each one marked with increasingly restrictive classification levels. The general examined the new materials with growing concern, his expression darkening as he absorbed the latest information. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, "this changes our risk assessment considerably." Captain Rodriguez leaned closer to examine the updated intelligence. "Sir, if this information is accurate, we're looking at a significantly more complex operational environment than originally assessed. Enemy capabilities appear to have advanced beyond our current countermeasure protocols." The familiar weight of command responsibility was evident in General Thornfield's posture as he processed the implications of the new intelligence. Harold recognized that particular tension, the burden of making decisions that would determine whether young soldiers returned home or became statistics in casualty reports. He'd carried that same weight for years these officers couldn't imagine. Captain Morrison's phone buzzed against the table, drawing annoyed glances from his superiors. He silenced the device quickly, then looked up at Harold with undisguised irritation. "Think you could keep the coffee coming without hovering so close?" he said sharply. "Some of us are trying to concentrate on actual military planning here." The dismissal stung precisely because Harold understood the planning better than anyone present. He'd anticipated enemy tactical evolution decades before these officers were commissioned, had written theoretical papers on adaptive defensive strategies that were now playing out exactly as he'd predicted. But today, his role was limited to ensuring caffeine availability. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes pointed to a specific section of the topographical maps spread across the conference table. Sir, the terrain analysis suggests 3 possible approach routes, but each one presents significant challenges. Route Alpha offers the best concealment, but requires a 15-mile overland movement through hostile territory. Harold had walked Route Alpha before it had a designation, when it was simply a goat path through mountains that held secrets these officers were still discovering. He'd established some of the navigation markers they would use, had cache supplies and locations that might still be operational after all these years. But his knowledge remained locked away by assumptions about his irrelevance. The conference room's air conditioning cycled on again, its quiet hum providing background noise for conversations that determined the fate of soldiers Harold would never meet, but whose faces he could imagine with startling clarity. Young men and women who would follow orders developed in this room, trusting that their commanders possessed the wisdom to bring them home safely. General Thornfield's expression grew increasingly grave as he studied the latest intelligence updates. The operational complexity had escalated beyond standard parameters, and Harold could see the weight of command settling more heavily on the general's shoulders. This was the moment when theoretical planning collided with the brutal reality of putting soldiers in harm's way. Captain Rodriguez highlighted specific coordinates on the digital display. Sir, our biggest concern is this defensive installation here. Enemy forces have constructed what appears to be a sophisticated early warning system that covers all traditional approach vectors. Any conventional insertion attempt will likely result in immediate detection and overwhelming hostile response. Harold's weathered hands gripped the coffee pot more tightly as he recognized the tactical situation being described. He'd faced identical challenges in that exact region 40 years earlier, had developed specific countermeasures that were now buried in classified archives these officers apparently hadn't consulted. The solutions existed, written in his own hand, if anyone had bothered to look. Major Patterson pulled up additional satellite imagery, his finger tracing potential infiltration routes on the large display screen. "What about this valley approach, sir?" he suggested, pointing to what appeared to be a natural corridor between mountain ridges. Satellite analysis shows minimal enemy presence, and it offers direct access to the target zone. That's a kill zone, Harold thought grimly, recognizing the terrain feature that had claimed American lives during his own operations in the region. The valley looked inviting from satellite imagery, but ground-level reality revealed carefully concealed defensive positions that turned the entire corridor into a deadly funnel. He learned that lesson through the sacrifice of good soldiers whose names were now engraved on memorial walls. Lieutenant Walsh consulted his tactical assessment notes. "Sir, based on enemy defensive patterns observed in recent operations, they appear to be using our own doctrine against us. It's almost as if they've studied our field manuals and are implementing specific countermeasures for each of our standard tactical approaches." The observation was more accurate than Lieutenant Walsh realized. Harold had written portions of those field manuals the enemy was apparently using so effectively. The tactical principles he developed through hard-won experience were now being turned against the very forces he'd trained to use them. The irony was both bitter and dangerous. General Thornfield stood and walked to the large map display, his hands clasped behind his back in the classic pose of a commander wrestling with impossible decisions. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, "I need you to run probability analyses on all 3 approach options. Factor in everything we know about enemy capabilities and recent tactical adaptations." As Captain Rodriguez began entering data into his tactical computer, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair and glanced toward Harold with unconcealed annoyance. "General," he said, "perhaps we should consider clearing non-essential personnel before we dive deeper into operational specifics." Some of these details are extremely sensitive. Harold felt the familiar sting of being reduced to non-essential personnel, despite standing in a room where his expertise could potentially save the lives being planned for. He'd gone from being the man who developed these tactics to being someone whose presence during tactical discussions was considered a security risk. Captain Morrison seized on his superior's suggestion with obvious enthusiasm. "Absolutely, sir," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "No offense to our coffee service, but operational security requires limiting access to personnel with specific need-to-know clearance. We can't have random civilians overhearing strategic planning details." Random civilian. The phrase hit Harold harder than enemy fire ever had. He'd spent more time in combat zones than all these officers combined, had earned his rank through battles they'd only studied in war college courses. Yet today, his decades of service were invisible beneath assumptions about his current role. General Thornfield paused his examination of the tactical display, his sharp eyes moving between his officers and Harold. The general's expression was unreadable, though something in his posture suggested deeper consideration than his subordinates expected. After a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, he spoke with characteristic decisiveness. "He stays," Thornfield said firmly. "Coffee service continues throughout the briefing. If Sergeant Vance has appropriate clearance for refreshment duty during classified discussions, then he has appropriate clearance to remain present while those discussions occur." His tone carried the authority of a man unaccustomed to having his decisions questioned. The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable, and Harold caught the slight stiffening in Major Patterson's posture as the officer realized his suggestion had been rejected. Captain Morrison's face showed barely concealed frustration at being denied the satisfaction of having Harold removed from the room like unwanted furniture. Harold appreciated the general's defense, though it still reduced him to someone whose presence required justification rather than someone whose expertise might prove valuable. He remained beside the service card, invisible despite being protected, irrelevant despite possessing knowledge that could alter the entire operational approach. Lieutenant Walsh returned his attention to the tactical displays, though Harold noticed the young officer's frequent glances in his direction. The briefing materials spread across the conference table represented thousands of hours of intelligence gathering and analysis, yet they missed crucial historical context that Harold carried in his memory. Captain Rodriguez completed his probability calculations, the results appearing on the main display screen in stark numerical terms. "Sir," he announced, "all three approach vectors show unacceptable casualty projections based on current intelligence. We're looking at potential losses exceeding 60% regardless of which route we select." 60% casualties. Harold had seen those numbers before, had faced similar impossible odds in the same region these officers were now planning to enter. The difference was that he'd found a way to reduce those numbers to manageable levels, had developed techniques that turned seemingly hopeless missions into successful operations. But that knowledge remained locked away by their assumptions about his irrelevance. General Thornfield's jaw tightened as he absorbed the casualty projections. The weight of command was visible in every line of his face. The terrible responsibility of sending young soldiers into situations where mathematics suggested most wouldn't return. Harold recognized that expression from his own mirrors during similar moments of decision. Major Patterson cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the conference room. "Sir, perhaps we should consider postponing the operation until we could develop more effective countermeasures. These casualty projections are beyond acceptable parameters for any mission, regardless of strategic importance." The suggestion of postponement carried its own risks, as Harold well knew. Delayed operations often became impossible operations as enemy defenses strengthened and intelligence grew stale. Time was a tactical factor these officers understood intellectually but hadn't experienced viscerally through watching opportunities slip away while perfect plans were pursued. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted additional intelligence reports, his expression growing more concerned with each page. "Sir, there's another factor we haven't fully considered. Recent communication intercepts suggest enemy forces have advanced knowledge of our general operational intentions. They appear to be preparing specifically for American-style tactical approaches. The enemy's preparation for American tactics wasn't surprising to Harold, who'd watched adversaries adapt and evolve throughout his career. What frustrated him was listening to officers struggle with countermeasures he'd already developed and proven effective. The solutions existed in their own archives, written by the man currently serving their coffee. The morning briefing had stretched past its scheduled duration, and Harold could sense the growing frustration among the officers as each tactical option proved more problematic than the last. General Thornfield stood motionless before the tactical display, his weathered face reflecting the weight of decisions that would determine whether young soldiers returned home or joined the ranks of those honored on memorial walls. Captain Morrison shifted impatiently in his leather chair, his attention drifting from the complex operational planning to Harold's quiet presence beside the coffee service. The captain's expression showed the particular irritation of someone forced to conduct serious business, while inconvenienced by what he perceived as unnecessary distractions. "You know what?" he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tactical discussion with deliberate loudness. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." He gestured toward Harold with barely disguised annoyance. "We're discussing highly classified operational details while some random old guy shuffles around pouring coffee. This is exactly the kind of security breach that ends careers." Harold's hands remained steady as he organized the coffee service, though he felt the familiar burn of injustice settling in his chest. Random old guy. The casual dismissal stung precisely because it reduced decades of distinguished service to nothing more than an inconvenient presence in a room where his expertise could save lives. Major Patterson seized on his subordinate's comment with obvious enthusiasm. "Morrison raises an excellent point, sir," he said, addressing General Thornfield directly. "Operational security protocols exist for good reason. Having civilians present during classified briefings violates basic compartmentalization principles, regardless of their supposed clearance levels." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting he'd been harboring similar concerns throughout the morning briefing. "Sir, I have to concur with Major Patterson's assessment. The sensitivity of Operation Midnight Eagle requires absolute discretion. We can't afford any potential security compromises, however unintentional they might be." The coordinated pressure was unmistakable, 3 field-grade officers presenting a united front against Harold's continued presence. Their arguments carried the weight of legitimate security concerns, though Harold knew their real motivation was simply discomfort with having someone they perceived as beneath their notice overhearing their professional discussions. General Thornfield's sharp eyes moved between his officers and Harold, his expression unreadable as he weighed their concerns against his earlier decision. The general's silence stretched long enough to make the other officers shift uncomfortably, uncertain whether their challenge to his authority had been wise or foolish. Captain Rodriguez attempted to redirect the conversation back to tactical matters. "Sir, perhaps we could table the personnel discussion and focus on resolving the operational challenges. We still haven't identified a viable approach vector that keeps casualty projections within acceptable parameters." But Captain Morrison wasn't finished pressing his point. "With all due respect, sir," he continued, his tone growing more insistent, "we're trying to plan a complex military operation while worrying about who might be listening in. The old man probably doesn't understand half of what we're discussing anyway. But that's not the point. Security protocols exist for everyone, not just people we think might pose a threat." Harold almost smiled at the irony. The young captain was correct that security protocols should apply equally to everyone, but completely wrong about Harold's understanding of the tactical discussion. Harold had not only grasped every nuance of the operational planning, he'd identified at least 3 critical flaws in their approach that could result in mission failure and unnecessary casualties. Lieutenant Walsh consulted his tablet, then looked up with an expression of manufactured concern. "Sir, there's another consideration. If something goes wrong with this operation, having unauthorized personnel present during planning phases could complicate any subsequent investigation. It creates unnecessary liability for everyone involved. The mention of potential investigations and liability clearly struck a nerve with several officers around the table. Harold watched their faces as they calculated personal risk against professional courtesy, their expressions revealing men more concerned with protecting their careers than respecting a fellow veteran service. General Thornfield finally broke his silence, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent making difficult decisions under pressure. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, "escort Sergeant Vance to the hallway. He can maintain coffee service from the outer office during the remainder of this briefing." The dismissal landed like a physical blow, though Harold had been expecting it since the coordinated pressure began. He'd faced enemy fire with less emotional impact than this casual ejection from a room where his knowledge could potentially save the lives these officers were planning to risk. Harold began gathering the coffee service materials with deliberate care, each movement reflecting the military precision that had defined his entire adult life. The china cups clinked softly against their saucers as he loaded them onto the service cart, the sound echoing in a conference room that had grown uncomfortably quiet. Captain Morrison's satisfaction was barely concealed as he watched Harold prepare to leave. Finally, he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for nearby officers to hear, "Now we can get back to actual military planning without worrying about eavesdroppers." Some of us take operational security seriously. Major Patterson leaned back in his chair with visible relief. "Much better, sir. Now we can discuss sensitive details without concerns about unauthorized disclosure. This is how classified briefings should be conducted from the beginning." Harold paused in his collection of coffee materials, his weathered hands gripping the cart's handle as he prepared to wheel it toward the conference room door. 40 years of classified briefings, 40 years of operational planning that had shaped modern military doctrine, and he was being escorted out like a security risk. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was already reaching for additional classified folders, eager to continue the tactical discussion without what he perceived as unwanted observation. "Sir, now that we can speak freely, I'd like to revisit some historical precedents for operations in this specific region. There might be lessons learned from previous engagements that could inform our current planning." Harold almost turned back at that comment. Historical precedents. He was one of those historical precedents, had written the after-action reports that would appear in any thorough research of previous operations in the Kandahar province. But those reports were filed under his name and rank, invisible to officers who saw only an old man serving coffee. Captain Rodriguez stood and moved toward the conference room door, clearly uncomfortable with his assigned role as Harold's escort. The captain's expression suggested he understood the indignity of the situation, but lacked the authority to challenge his superior's decision. General Thornfield had already turned his attention back to the tactical displays, his focus shifting to the operational challenges that demanded resolution regardless of who was present to witness the discussion. The general's weathered face showed the strain of command, the burden of making decisions with incomplete information and unacceptable alternatives. As Harold wheeled the service cart toward the door, he caught fragments of conversation resuming behind him. The officers were eager to return to their planning, confident that removing the old coffee server had somehow improved their operational security and enhanced their ability to develop effective tactics. The conference room door closed behind Harold with a soft click that seemed to echo through the Pentagon's marble hallway like a final verdict. Captain Rodriguez stood beside him for an awkward moment, his young face reflecting the discomfort of a professional soldier forced to treat a fellow veteran like a security risk. "I'm sorry about this, Sergeant Vance," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice barely audible in the wide corridor. The captain's eyes avoided direct contact, focusing instead on the polished floor where Harold's reflection appeared fractured in the glossy marble surface. Harold positioned the coffee service cart against the hallway wall, his movements precise despite the sting of dismissal. "No need to apologize, Captain," he replied evenly. "You're following orders." I understand how the chain of command works. His voice carried no bitterness, though the irony of explaining military hierarchy to an officer wasn't lost on him. The Pentagon's executive hallway stretched in both directions, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished generals whose stern gazes seemed to witness Harold's exile from discussions he'd once led. The morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated brass nameplates and service ribbons that told stories of American military history, stories Harold had helped write but was now deemed unworthy to overhear. Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the closed conference room door, where muffled voices indicated the tactical discussion had resumed. "I'll make sure you're called back in when they need coffee service," he said, though his tone suggested he doubted that moment would come anytime soon. Harold nodded his understanding, settling into the patient stance of a soldier accustomed to waiting. 40 years of military service had taught him that hurry up and wait was more than just a phrase. It was a fundamental aspect of military life that applied regardless of rank or circumstance. Through the conference room's thick wooden door, Harold could hear fragments of conversation as the officers returned to their operational planning. The voices were indistinct, but he caught enough words to follow their general direction. They were still struggling with the same tactical problems, still searching for solutions that existed in classified files they apparently hadn't consulted. Captain Rodriguez checked his watch, then looked back at Harold with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with competing loyalties. "Sergeant," he said hesitantly, "can I ask you something? Off the record?" The young officer's tone carried a weight that went beyond casual curiosity. Harold studied the captain's face, recognizing the expression of someone carrying knowledge that felt too heavy for his rank. "Of course, Captain. What's on your mind?" His response was gentle, the tone of an older soldier who'd mentored countless young officers through moments of doubt. "Your service record," Rodriguez said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I had to review it for your security clearance update last month. Some of the details were unusual. Operations that are still classified at levels I don't have access to. Commendations from conflicts that officially never happened." Harold felt a familiar chill settle in his chest. His service record was compartmentalized across multiple classification levels, with the most significant operations buried so deeply that few current officers would ever see them. The fact that Captain Rodriguez had noticed unusual elements suggested the young man was more observant than his peers. The hallway's grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its deep tones reverberating off marble walls that had witnessed decades of military history. Harold counted the chimes automatically, a habit developed during years when precise timing meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Captain Rodriguez stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "Sergeant, those ribbons on your uniform. I've seen similar displays in the Pentagon's Medal of Honor gallery. The arrangement is very specific, very distinctive. I've studied military decorations extensively, and that particular combination is extremely rare." Harold's weathered hands remained steady, though his pulse quickened slightly. The young captain's observation skills were sharper than those of his superiors, who dismissed Harold's ribbon rack as surplus store decorations without bothering to examine the specific awards represented by each colored strip. The conference room door remained closed, but Harold could hear the discussion growing more animated as the officers encountered the same tactical obstacles he'd faced decades earlier. Their frustration was audible even through the thick wooden barrier, voices rising as they struggled with problems that had already been solved by the man they'd ejected from the room. Rodriguez consulted his smartphone, scrolling through what appeared to be official military databases. "Sergeant," he said carefully, "I ran a search on some of the operations mentioned in your file. Cross-reference them with historical records and declassified after-action reports. Some very interesting names kept appearing in the documentation." Harold maintained his neutral expression, though he could guess which names had caught the captain's attention. His own signature appeared on operational summaries and tactical assessments that had shaped modern military doctrine, though those documents were filed away in archives that current officers rarely consulted. The young captain's phone screen reflected his growing realization as he compared information from multiple sources. One name in particular appeared repeatedly in connection with operations in the exact region they're discussing in there, Rodriguez said, nodding toward the conference room. Advanced tactical innovations that are still being used today, counterinsurgency techniques that became standard operating procedure. Harold had developed many of those techniques through necessity rather than theory, had refined them through the crucible of actual combat, where academic principles met brutal reality. The tactical innovations these officers considered historical precedents had been born from his direct experience in the very terrain they were now planning to enter. Captain Rodriguez's expression showed the dawning comprehension of someone piecing together a puzzle that had seemed impossible moments earlier. The timeline matches perfectly, he said quietly. The operations, the awards, the specific expertise in that exact region. Sergeant, who exactly are you? The question hung in the hallway's pristine air like morning mist, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple curiosity. Harold could hear the conference room discussion growing more heated as the officers struggled with tactical problems that had defined his own career, problems he'd solved through methods they were apparently unable to discover through their research. Before Harold could respond to Captain Rodriguez's question, the conference room door opened suddenly. Major Patterson emerged, looking frustrated, his expression showing the strain of dealing with operational challenges that seemed to have no acceptable solutions. "Where's that coffee?" Patterson demanded, his eyes settling on Harold with renewed irritation. "We've been in there for 20 minutes without refreshment service. Some of us need caffeine to think clearly about complex military operations." His tone suggested he blamed Harold for the delay, rather than acknowledging that he'd been ordered to leave the room. Captain Rodriguez straightened to attention, his moment of revelation interrupted by his superior's demand. "Sir, Sergeant Vance has been maintaining the coffee service as ordered. I can escort him back into the conference room immediately if you need refreshments." Harold began preparing the coffee cart for return service, though his mind remained focused on Captain Rodriguez's questions and the implications of what the young officer had discovered. The moment of recognition he'd sensed building was closer than he'd anticipated, brought about by one observant captain rather than through any dramatic revelation. Major Patterson's impatience was evident as he watched Harold organize the coffee service. "Just get him back in there with fresh coffee," he said dismissively, "and make sure he stays near the service station this time. We don't need him wandering around during sensitive discussions." His words carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to treating support personnel as extensions of the equipment they operated. Harold wheeled the coffee cart back into the conference room, the familiar weight of dismissive stares settling over him like an uncomfortable uniform. The tactical discussion had clearly stalled during his absence, with officers clustered around the display screens showing increasing signs of frustration as they encountered the same operational obstacles that had seemed insurmountable moments earlier. Captain Rodriguez followed Harold into the room, his expression thoughtful as he took his position at the conference table. The young captain's eyes lingered on Harold's ribbon rack with new understanding, studying the specific arrangement of awards that told a story the other officers couldn't read. General Thornfield looked up from a spread of satellite photographs, his weathered face showing the strain of command as he wrestled with tactical problems that seemed to have no acceptable solutions. The casualty projections remained unacceptably high, and time was running short for developing alternative approaches to Operation Midnight Eagle. Major Patterson immediately gestured toward his empty coffee cup, his impatience evident as Harold approached with the freshly brewed pot. "About time," he said curtly. "Some of us have been trying to solve complex military problems while waiting for basic refreshment service." His tone suggested that Harold's brief absence had somehow contributed to their tactical difficulties. Harold filled the major's cup with steady hands, though he could sense Captain Rodriguez watching his every movement with growing recognition. The young officer's research had clearly uncovered connections that his superiors had missed, links between Harold's service record and the very operations they were struggling to understand. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted yet another set of classified documents, his expression growing more frustrated with each page. "Sir, we've exhausted our standard tactical approaches," he announced to General Thornfield. "Every conventional insertion method results in unacceptable casualty projections. We need to think outside normal operational parameters." Think outside normal operational parameters. Harold almost smiled at the phrase, remembering when those same unconventional approaches had been developed through necessity rather than theoretical planning. The innovations these officers needed already existed, tested through actual combat in the exact terrain they were now preparing to enter. Captain Morrison leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup balanced carelessly in one hand as he gestured toward the tactical displays. "Maybe we're overthinking this," he suggested with the confidence of someone who'd never faced enemy fire. "Sometimes the direct approach is the most effective, regardless of what computer models predict." Harold's jaw tightened slightly as he recognized the dangerous thinking that had cost lives throughout military history. Computer models existed precisely because direct approaches often resulted in catastrophic casualties when facing well-prepared enemies. The young captain's suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of tactical reality. Lieutenant Walsh pulled up historical data on his tablet, scrolling through previous operations in the Kandahar region. "Sir," he said to General Thornfield, "there were several successful missions in this area during the late 1970s and early 80s. Unfortunately, most of the tactical details remain classified at levels above our current access." Captain Rodriguez's eyes met Harold's across the conference room, a moment of understanding passing between them that went unnoticed by the other officers. The young captain had clearly identified the connection between Harold's service record and those historical operations, had realized that the man serving coffee possessed first-hand knowledge of the very missions they were trying to research. General Thornfield stood and approached the large tactical display, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied terrain features that held secrets these officers couldn't access. "We need those historical precedents," he said quietly. "Someone developed effective tactics for this exact scenario. The solutions exist somewhere in our archives." The irony was overwhelming. Harold had written many of those archive solutions, had developed the tactical innovations that could turn Operation Midnight Eagle from a potential disaster into a successful mission. But the knowledge remained locked away by assumptions about his current role and capabilities. Major Patterson's frustration boiled over as he slammed his coffee cup against the conference table. "This is ridiculous," he declared loudly. "We're the finest military minds in the Pentagon, and we can't figure out how to conduct a simple extraction mission. There has to be someone with expertise in this specific region. Someone with expertise in this specific region." Harold maintained his neutral expression, though the answer to Major Patterson's demand stood 3 feet away, invisible beneath their collective assumptions about his irrelevance. He possessed more expertise in the Kandahar region than all the officers combined, but that knowledge might as well have been classified at levels beyond their reach. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted his smartphone, apparently searching military databases for additional information. "Sir, there are references to innovative tactical approaches developed during that time period, but the specific methodologies are buried in classified operational summaries. Most of the original architects of those tactics have either retired or passed away." Captain Rodriguez shifted in his seat, his internal struggle evident as he weighed his growing certainty against the professional risk of challenging his superior's assumptions. His research had clearly revealed Harold's true identity, but speaking that knowledge aloud would require courage that extended beyond normal military courtesy. The conference room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the officers confronted the reality that their standard approaches were inadequate for the mission's requirements. General Thornfield's expression showed the weight of command as he calculated the human cost of proceeding with flawed tactical plans versus the strategic consequences of mission failure. Harold continued his coffee service rounds, moving quietly between officers who debated problems he'd already solved decades earlier. The solutions they needed existed, not in classified databases or historical archives, but in the mind of the man they dismissed as a security risk unworthy of overhearing their discussions. Captain Morrison threw his hands up in exasperation. "We're going in circles," he announced to the room. "Every option we develop hits the same obstacles. It's like the enemy knows our playbook better than we do. They're using our own tactics against us, and we can't figure out how to counter our own doctrine." The enemy's knowledge of American tactics wasn't surprising to Harold, who'd watched adversaries adapt and evolve throughout his career. What frustrated him was listening to officers struggle with countermeasures that were already documented in reports they apparently couldn't access or hadn't thought to consult. General Thornfield returned to his seat, his shoulders carrying the visible weight of decisions that would determine whether young soldiers returned home safely or joined the ranks of those honored on memorial walls. The general's sharp eyes moved between his officers and the tactical displays, searching for inspiration that seemed to elude everyone present. Lieutenant Walsh looked up from his tablet with sudden interest. "Sir, I found something unusual in the historical records. There's repeated mention of a tactical advisor who developed revolutionary approaches for this exact region. Someone who apparently turned impossible missions into successful operations through innovative thinking." Harold's pulse quickened slightly as he recognized the direction of Lieutenant Walsh's research. The young officer was approaching the same connections that Captain Rodriguez had already discovered, though from a different angle that might prove even more revealing. Captain Rodriguez's expression showed his internal conflict as he listened to Lieutenant Walsh's findings. The young captain clearly wanted to share his own discoveries, but the implications of revealing Harold's true identity in front of his superiors carried professional risks that extended far beyond simple embarrassment. Lieutenant Walsh's fingers moved rapidly across his tablet screen as he delved deeper into the historical military databases, his expression growing more animated with each discovery. "Sir," he announced to General Thornfield, "I'm finding extensive documentation about unconventional tactics that were apparently revolutionary for their time. Multiple successful operations in the exact terrain we're discussing." Harold's weathered hands remained steady as he organized the coffee service, though he could feel the weight of approaching revelation settling over the conference room like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. The young lieutenant was tracing connections that led directly to missions Harold had planned and executed when these officers were still children. General Thornfield leaned forward with renewed interest, his sharp eyes focusing on Lieutenant Walsh's research with the intensity of a commander desperate for actionable intelligence. "What kind of tactics are we talking about, Lieutenant? Can you access the specific methodologies that made these operations successful?" Lieutenant Walsh scrolled through classified documents that appeared on his secure tablet, his voice taking on the excitement of someone uncovering buried treasure. "Sir, there are references to innovative infiltration techniques that bypass traditional defensive perimeters. Something called the Vance Protocol appears repeatedly in mission summaries from that era." The Vance Protocol. Harold's pulse quickened as he heard his own tactical innovation mentioned in the conference room, where he'd been dismissed as a security risk. He developed that approach through necessity during a particularly difficult mission, refining it through subsequent operations until it became standard doctrine for similar scenarios. Captain Rodriguez's eyes widened as he heard the name connected to the tactical innovation, his earlier research suddenly clicking into place with devastating clarity. The young captain's gaze moved between Lieutenant Walsh's tablet and Harold's position beside the coffee cart, understanding dawning across his features like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. Major Patterson's impatience was evident as he gestured dismissively toward Lieutenant Walsh's discovery. "Protocols and innovations from 40 years ago aren't going to help us with current operational realities," he declared. "Modern enemy capabilities have evolved far beyond what those old tactics were designed to counter." Harold almost smiled at Major Patterson's confident dismissal. The Major was wrong on multiple levels, but Harold's knowledge of how those tactics had been adapted and refined for modern threats remained invisible beneath assumptions about his current role. The Vance Protocol had evolved along with enemy capabilities, though those updates existed only in his mind. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted his own classified materials, cross-referencing Lieutenant Walsh's findings with current intelligence assessments. Sir, there might be something here worth investigating further. These historical operations achieve success rates that seem almost impossible given the tactical challenges described in contemporary reports. Almost impossible success rates. Harold remembered the missions that had generated those statistics, remembered the careful planning and split-second decisions that had turned potential disasters into operational victories. The success hadn't been impossible, just unprecedented for its time and circumstances. General Thornfield stood and moved to the tactical display, his weathered face reflecting growing interest in Lieutenant Walsh's research. "Can you access the actual tactical specifications?" he asked. "If these protocols were as effective as the mission summaries suggest, we need to understand how they worked." Lieutenant Walsh's fingers flew across his tablet as he searched deeper into the classified archives, his expression showing frustration as he encountered security barriers. "Sir, most of the detailed tactical information is classified above my current access level. I can see references to specific innovations, but the actual implementation details are restricted." Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat quietly, his internal struggle evident as he weighed professional caution against growing certainty about Harold's identity. "Sir," he said carefully, "I might have additional information that could help clarify some of these historical references. My recent research into personnel records has revealed some interesting connections." Harold felt the moment of truth approaching like an incoming artillery shell, inevitable and impossible to avoid. Captain Rodriguez's careful words suggested the young officer was preparing to reveal what he'd discovered, to connect the historical tactical innovations with a man currently serving coffee in their conference room. Major Patterson's irritation flared as the discussion moved away from current operational planning toward historical research. "With all due respect, sir," he said to General Thornfield, "we don't have time to chase down 40-year-old tactical theories. We need practical solutions for modern problems, not archaeological expeditions through military archives." Archaeological expeditions. Harold's jaw tightened at the dismissive phrase, though he understood Major Patterson's frustration with the apparent detour from immediate tactical concerns. The Major couldn't know that the historical research was leading directly to the most practical solution available for their current operational challenges. Lieutenant Walsh looked up from his tablet with sudden excitement. "Sir, I found something significant. The Vance Protocol wasn't just effective in historical operations, it was apparently designed to be adaptable to evolving enemy capabilities. The documentation suggests it was created by someone who understood tactical evolution better than anyone of that era. Someone who understood tactical evolution." Harold had indeed understood that enemy capabilities would advance, had built flexibility into his tactical innovations specifically to accommodate future adaptations. The protocols these officers were researching had been designed to remain effective across decades of changing battlefield conditions. General Thornfield's expression showed renewed hope as he absorbed Lieutenant Walsh's findings. If these protocols are as adaptable as the documentation suggests, they might provide exactly what we need for Operation Midnight Eagle. "Can you determine who developed these tactical innovations?" Harold's weathered hands gripped the coffee cart's handle more tightly as the question he'd been anticipating finally emerged. The answer stood 3 feet away from General Thornfield, invisible beneath decades of assumptions about age and current role, but Captain Rodriguez's research had already uncovered the truth. Captain Rodriguez took a deep breath, his young face showing the courage of someone preparing to challenge his superior's fundamental assumptions. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe I can answer that question. My research into personnel records has revealed some remarkable connections between historical operations and current personnel assignments." The conference room fell silent except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant murmur of Pentagon corridor traffic. Harold could feel the weight of approaching revelation as Captain Rodriguez prepared to speak words that would transform the entire dynamic of their tactical discussion. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked between Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Walsh, his expression showing confusion about the direction their research was taking. Rodriguez, he said impatiently, "What exactly are you suggesting? How do personnel records connect to tactical innovations from 4 decades ago?" Harold maintained his position beside the coffee service, his military bearing unchanged despite the growing tension that filled the conference room like smoke from a distant fire. The moment he'd sensed approaching since the morning's first dismissive comment was finally arriving, brought about by one observant captain's careful research rather than any dramatic gesture on his part. Major Patterson's annoyance was evident as he watched the discussion move further away from immediate operational concerns. "This is becoming ridiculous," he declared loudly. "We're supposed to be planning a critical mission, not conducting genealogical research on obsolete tactical theories. Can we please return to addressing current realities?" Current realities. Harold almost spoke then, almost broke his silence to explain that the current realities these officers faced were identical to challenges he'd solved decades earlier. But discipline held him quiet as Captain Rodriguez prepared to reveal what his research had uncovered. Captain Rodriguez stood slowly, his young face reflecting the gravity of what he was about to reveal. The conference room's atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation as all eyes focused on the captain, who had promised to explain the connection between historical tactical innovations and current personnel assignments. "Sir," Rodriguez began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his revelation, "the Vance protocol that Lieutenant Walsh discovered in the historical archives wasn't developed by some long-retired tactical theorist. The documentation shows it was created by Sergeant First Class Harold Vance, currently assigned to refreshment services for this very conference room." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the conference room's air conditioning cycling on with a mechanical hum that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Harold maintained his position beside the coffee cart, his weathered face showing no emotion as decades of assumptions crumbled around him like walls struck by artillery. General Thornfield's sharp eyes moved from Captain Rodriguez to Harold, his expression transforming from confusion to dawning comprehension. The general's weathered face showed the shock of recognition as he processed the implications of what he'd just heard, his mind recalibrating everything that had occurred during the morning briefing. Lieutenant Walsh's tablet slipped slightly in his hands as he stared at Harold with growing amazement. "Sir," he said quietly, "if that's accurate, then we've been discussing tactical problems with the man who literally wrote the solutions." The Vance protocol appears in dozens of successful operations throughout the 80s and 90s. Major Patterson's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, his expression showing the particular shock of someone realizing they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The Major's face drained of color as he absorbed the reality that he'd been dismissing and insulting a legendary tactical innovator whose methods were still being studied in war colleges. Harold's silence stretched through the conference room like a held breath, his military bearing unchanged despite the transformation occurring in the officers' perceptions. He'd endured their dismissal with dignity, and he would accept their recognition with the same quiet professionalism that had defined his entire career. Captain Morrison's mouth opened slightly, though no words emerged as he struggled to process the revelation. The young officer who had been most vocal about treating Harold as a security risk now faced the reality that he'd been insulting someone whose tactical genius had shaped modern military doctrine. General Thornfield stepped closer to Harold, his authoritative presence filling the space between them as he studied the ribbon rack he'd previously ignored. "Sergeant Vance," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command recognition, "I believe I owe you an apology." "We all do." Harold's weathered hands remained steady as he met the general's gaze with quiet dignity. "No apology necessary, sir," he replied evenly. "I understand how the situation appeared. Military protocol requires appropriate security considerations during classified briefings." His response carried no bitterness, though the officer's earlier treatment had cut deeper than enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted his smartphone frantically, searching military databases with the urgency of someone trying to confirm an impossible truth. "The documentation is extensive," he announced to the room, his voice showing amazement. Harold Vance appears as primary tactical advisor on operations that are still classified at levels I've never seen before. Captain Rodriguez pulled up additional files on his tablet, his research now taking on new significance as he shared his earlier discoveries. "Sir, Sergeant Vance's service record includes commendations for tactical innovations that became standard operating procedure across multiple theaters of operation. The Medal of Honor appears among his decorations, awarded for actions during Operation Thunderstrike." Operation Thunderstrike. Harold remembered that mission with crystalline clarity, remembered the decisions that had saved an entire platoon from certain death, while completing objectives that had seemed impossible. The medal represented more than personal recognition. It symbolized the lives of soldiers who had returned home because of tactical innovations born from desperate necessity. Major Patterson set his coffee cup down with trembling hands, his face showing the horror of someone realizing they'd treated a Medal of Honor recipient as an inconvenient civilian. "Sir," he said to Harold, his voice barely audible, "I had no idea. The things I said, the way I treated you. There's no excuse for that level of disrespect." Harold's expression remained neutral as he acknowledged Major Patterson's apology. "You treated me according to your understanding of the situation, Major. No permanent harm was done." His forgiveness was immediate and complete, though the officer's assumptions had revealed uncomfortable truths about how easily service could be forgotten. General Thornfield's posture shifted to attention as he fully absorbed the reality of Harold's identity and accomplishments. "Sergeant Vance," he said formally, "I need to ask for your assistance with Operation Midnight Eagle. Your expertise in the target region could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." The request transformed Harold from dismissed coffee server to essential tactical advisor in a single sentence. The problems these officers had struggled with for hours were indeed solvable, and the solutions existed in the mind of the man they'd ejected from the room as a security risk. Lieutenant Walsh looked up from his tablet with growing excitement. "Sir, if Sergeant Vance developed the original protocols for operations in this region, he would understand the tactical challenges better than anyone currently in service. His knowledge could revolutionize our entire approach to Operation Midnight Eagle." Captain Morrison found his voice finally, though his words came out strained and uncertain. "Sergeant Vance," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for every dismissive comment I made. I treated a genuine American hero like he was invisible, and there's no excuse for that kind of ignorance." Harold nodded acknowledgement of Captain Morrison's apology, his weathered face showing the patience of someone who had long ago learned to separate individual actions from systemic problems. The captain's personal disrespect stung, but Harold understood that it reflected broader issues with how veterans were perceived and valued. The conference room's atmosphere had transformed completely, shifting from dismissive arrogance to respectful recognition as the officers grappled with the magnitude of their error. The man they'd treated as an inconvenient presence was revealed as a living legend whose tactical innovations had saved countless lives throughout decades of military operations. Captain Rodriguez closed his tablet and looked directly at Harold with newfound respect. "Sergeant," he said sincerely, "your service record reads like a textbook of military excellence. The fact that you've endured our treatment with such dignity speaks to the character that earned you those decorations in the first place." Harold's silence had spoken louder than any protest could have, his quiet endurance of their dismissal demonstrating the same strength that had carried him through decades of dangerous missions. The revelation of his identity was less important than the grace with which he'd handled their ignorance. General Thornfield stepped back and rendered a crisp salute, his action immediately followed by every other officer in the conference room. The gesture transformed the space from a place where Harold had been barely tolerated to one where he was honored for the service and sacrifice he represented. Harold moved away from the coffee car for the first time that morning, his military bearing transforming from that of a service provider to that of a tactical advisor as he approached the conference table where classified materials spread across its polished surface. The officers instinctively made space for him, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by respectful attention. General Thornfield gestured toward the tactical displays showing the Kandahar province terrain. "Sergeant Vance," he said formally, "we've been struggling with insertion options that keep casualty projections within acceptable parameters. Every conventional approach results in losses exceeding 60% of the strike team." Harold studied the satellite imagery with the practiced eye of someone who had walked those valleys when they were unmapped territory on classified missions. The terrain hadn't changed, but the enemy's understanding of American tactics had evolved significantly since his last operations in the region. "The valley approach you've been considering," Harold said quietly, pointing to the route Major Patterson had suggested earlier, "was a kill zone during my operations in 1981. Enemy forces constructed overlapping defensive positions that turned the entire corridor into a funnel. We lost a full squad before we understood the tactical reality." Major Patterson's face showed the shock of someone realizing how close his suggestion had come to recreating a historical disaster. "Sir," he said to Harold, "the satellite imagery showed minimal enemy presence in that area. How did you identify the danger that our intelligence analysts missed?" Harold's weathered finger traced the valley's contours on the digital display. "Satellite imagery shows current positioning, Major, but doesn't reveal historical patterns of enemy defensive doctrine. They've been using this terrain the same way for 40 years because it works. The positions appear empty because they're designed to be invisible until activation." Lieutenant Walsh leaned forward with intense interest, his tablet ready to record Harold's tactical insights. "Sergeant Vance," he said respectfully, "how did you develop successful approaches for this specific terrain? The historical mission summaries indicate remarkable success rates despite the challenges you're describing." Harold moved to a different section of the tactical display, his movements precise as he indicated terrain features that held significance invisible to satellite analysis. "The key wasn't avoiding their defensive zones, Lieutenant. It was understanding that they expected us to avoid them. The Vance Protocol used their defensive expectations against them." Captain Rodriguez consulted his research notes, cross-referencing Harold's current explanation with the historical documentation he'd discovered. "Sir, the mission records mentioned something called reverse infiltration. The terminology appears repeatedly, but the specific methodology remained classified above my access level." Reverse infiltration, Harold explained, moving to highlight specific approach vectors on the display, meant entering through their strongest defensive positions rather than their weakest. Enemy forces concentrated their surveillance on obvious approach routes, while assuming their most fortified positions were too dangerous for American insertion attempts. The conference room fell silent as the officers absorbed the counterintuitive logic of Harold's tactical innovation. General Thornfield's expression showed the recognition of strategic thinking that operated on a level beyond conventional military doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes studied the terrain features Harold had indicated, his expression showing growing comprehension. "Sir, you're suggesting that what appears to be the most dangerous approach is actually the safest because enemy forces don't expect anyone to be that bold." "Exactly, Colonel," Harold confirmed. Enemy defensive doctrine assumed American forces would seek the path of least resistance. By choosing the path of greatest apparent resistance, we achieved tactical surprise that neutralized their defensive advantages. The approach required precise timing and execution, but it turned their strongest positions into tactical liabilities. Captain Morrison's tablet displayed historical mission data as he tried to understand the full scope of Harold's innovations. "Sergeant Vance," he said with newfound respect, "the success rates for operations using your protocols seem almost impossible. How did you maintain such effectiveness across multiple missions?" Harold's weathered face showed the weight of memories that included both triumphs and losses. "Success wasn't guaranteed, Captain. It It required understanding that enemy forces adapted to our tactics just as we adapted to theirs. Each mission had to incorporate lessons learned from previous operations while anticipating enemy countermeasures. General Thornfield approached the tactical display, where Harold had outlined potential approach vectors for Operation Midnight Eagle. These historical insights are invaluable, Sergeant, but how do we adapt 40-year-old tactics for current enemy capabilities? Technology has evolved significantly since your active operations. The principles remain constant, sir, Harold replied, his finger tracing updated approach routes that incorporated modern considerations. Enemy psychology and terrain advantages haven't changed, only the tools available for exploitation. The Vance protocol was designed to be adaptable because tactical innovation requires continuous evolution. Lieutenant Walsh's excitement was evident as he recorded Harold's explanations. Sir, this represents a complete paradigm shift from our current operational planning. Instead of avoiding enemy strengths, we exploit their defensive expectations to achieve surprise through apparent impossibility. Harold nodded acknowledgement of the lieutenant's understanding. The psychological component is as important as the tactical execution, Lieutenant. Enemy forces must believe their strongest positions are impregnable. That confidence becomes a vulnerability when properly exploited through precise timing and coordinated action. Major Patterson studied the revised approach vectors Harold had outlined, his expression showing amazement at the elegant simplicity of the tactical solution. Sergeant Vance, he said quietly, this reduces our casualty projections from 60% to approximately 15%. How is such a dramatic improvement possible? The improvement comes from understanding that enemy defensive doctrine creates predictable patterns, Major. Harold's explanation carried the authority of hard-won experience. When you understand those patterns, you can design approaches that exploit weaknesses in what appears to be overwhelming strength. Captain Rodriguez looked up from his detailed notes, his face showing the recognition of tactical genius that transcended normal military thinking. Sir, these protocols don't just solve our current operational challenges. They provide a framework for approaching similar problems across multiple theaters of operation. Harold's expression showed satisfaction at the young captain's insight. That was the original intention, Captain. Tactical innovations should be transferable across different operational environments. The specific applications change, but the underlying principles remain applicable to any scenario where enemy forces rely on predictable defensive assumptions. General Thornfield stepped back from the tactical display, his weathered face showing the relief of a commander who had found solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Sergeant Vance, he said formally, your expertise has transformed our entire approach to Operation Midnight Eagle. What you've shared could save dozens of lives. Harold's response carried the humility of someone who had served without seeking recognition. That's the mission, sir. Every tactical innovation exists to bring our soldiers home safely while accomplishing strategic objectives. The recognition matters less than the results. The conference room's atmosphere had completely transformed from the morning's dismissive environment to one of respectful collaboration. The officers who had questioned Harold's presence now hung on his every word, understanding they were receiving tactical education from a living legend whose innovations continued to shape modern military doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted his operational timeline, his expression showing renewed confidence in mission success. Sir, with these tactical modifications, we can proceed with Operation Midnight Eagle within the original time frame. Sergeant Vance's insights have eliminated the primary obstacles that were forcing operational delays. Harold remained focused on the tactical display, his mind already working through contingency plans and potential adaptations that might be necessary if enemy forces had evolved beyond his historical understanding. Even the most effective tactics required flexibility and continuous refinement based on operational results. The tactical planning session that had begun with frustration and seemingly impossible casualty projections now flowed with the precision of a well-orchestrated military operation. Harold stood at the center of the collaborative effort, his weathered hands moving across the digital displays as he refined approach vectors and timing sequences that would transform Operation Midnight Eagle from potential disaster to probable success. General Thornfield coordinated with his communications team, relaying the tactical modifications to field commanders who would implement Harold's innovations within hours. The general's voice carried new confidence as he described approaches that had seemed impossible when a morning briefing began. Harold's explanation of infiltration timing drew intense attention from every officer present. The window for insertion occurs during their shift change protocols, he said, indicating specific time markers on the operational timeline. Enemy defensive doctrine follows predictable patterns based on personnel rotation schedules that haven't changed significantly since my operations. Lieutenant Walsh documented every detail of Harold's tactical insights, his tablet recording information that would become part of official operational doctrine for future missions. "Sir," he said with obvious admiration, "your understanding of enemy behavioral patterns is extraordinary. How did you develop such detailed knowledge of their operational habits?" Harold's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to explain decades of accumulated intelligence. "You learn enemy patterns by surviving their defensive measures repeatedly, Lieutenant. Each encounter teaches you something new about their tactical thinking. After enough operations, their responses become predictable." Captain Rodriguez cross-referenced Harold's timing specifications with current intelligence reports, his research revealing connections between historical patterns and contemporary enemy behavior. "Sergeant Vance," he announced with excitement, "your predictions about enemy shift rotations match perfectly with our latest surveillance data. Their operational patterns are identical to what you described from 40 years ago." The consistency of enemy tactics across decades confirmed Harold's strategic assessment that human behavioral patterns remain constant despite technological evolution. Modern surveillance equipment could provide real-time confirmation of tactical assumptions he developed through direct experience in life-or-death situations. Major Patterson studied the revised mission timeline with growing amazement. "Sir," he said to Harold, "this approach reduces not only casualty projections, but also operational duration. The entire mission can be completed in half the time we originally estimated. How is such efficiency possible?" "Efficiency comes from understanding enemy decision-making processes, Major," Harold explained. "When you know how they'll respond to specific situations, you can design actions that force predictable reactions. The mission becomes a sequence of calculated moves rather than improvised responses to unexpected developments." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted updated intelligence assessments that incorporated Harold's tactical insights. "Sir, field commanders are reporting increased confidence in mission success based on these modified protocols. Morale has improved significantly now that we have actionable solutions rather than theoretical approaches." Harold's satisfaction was evident as he heard reports of improved soldier confidence. Field morale was always the most important indicator of mission viability. Soldiers who understood their tactical approach and believed in its effectiveness performed better under pressure than those who questioned their operational plan. General Thornfield received confirmation from multiple command levels that Harold's tactical modifications had been integrated into operational orders throughout the chain of command. "Sergeant Vance," he said with obvious gratitude, "your contributions have transformed this entire operation. What seemed impossible this morning is now achievable." The transformation went beyond tactical improvements to encompass a fundamental shift in how the officers perceived experience and expertise. Harold's quiet competence had taught them that assumptions about age and current role could blind them to invaluable knowledge standing directly beside them. Captain Morrison approached Harold with an expression of deep respect, mixed with personal shame. "Sir," he said quietly, "I need to acknowledge something beyond my earlier apologies. Your grace under the treatment you received from us reveals character that goes far beyond tactical expertise. You taught us about dignity as much as military strategy." Harold's response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to separate individual actions from systemic problems. Captain, every military generation faces similar challenges in recognizing expertise that doesn't fit expected patterns. The important thing is learning from those mistakes and applying those lessons to future interactions. Lieutenant Walsh looked up from his comprehensive documentation of Harold's tactical innovations. Sergeant Vance, these protocols should be integrated into advanced tactical training at all military academies. Current and future officers need to understand these principles rather than rediscovering them through trial and error. The suggestion pleased Harold, who had always believed that tactical knowledge served its highest purpose when transmitted to subsequent generations of military leaders. Teaching these principles to young officers could prevent the casualties that resulted from repeatedly learning the same lessons through combat experience. Captain Rodriguez completed his cross-reference analysis between Harold's historical innovations and current operational requirements. "Sir," he announced to the room, "every major tactical challenge we've encountered in recent operations could have been resolved more effectively using variations of Sergeant Vance's protocols. We've been struggling with problems that were solved decades ago." The recognition that solutions existed in their own archives raised uncomfortable questions about how military institutional knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Harold's expertise had been sitting in classified files while officers struggled with tactical problems their predecessors had already solved. General Thornfield addressed the broader implications of the morning's discoveries. "This experience reveals significant gaps in how we access and utilize historical tactical knowledge," he said to his officers. "We need systematic changes to ensure that expertise like Sergeant Vance's remains available to current operational planning." Harold appreciated the general's commitment to institutional improvement, though he understood that changing military bureaucracy required persistent effort across multiple command levels. The important thing was ensuring that future soldiers benefited from lessons learned through previous sacrifices. The conference room's atmosphere now reflected collaboration between colleagues rather than the dismissive hierarchy that had characterized the morning's early interactions. Harold had earned his place at the tactical planning table through demonstrated expertise rather than rank or formal position. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received final confirmations that field units had successfully integrated Harold's tactical modifications into their operational preparations. "Sir," he reported to General Thornfield, "all command levels report readiness for mission execution using the modified protocols. Estimated time to operational completion has been reduced by 60%. Harold's innovations had achieved exactly what tactical excellence should accomplish, transforming complex challenges into manageable operations while minimizing risk to the soldiers who would execute the mission. The human cost of military action was always the most important consideration in tactical planning." Major Patterson summarized the dramatic transformation that had occurred during the extended briefing session. "Sir," he said to Harold, "we began this morning with an impossible mission and unacceptable casualty projections. Your expertise has given us a viable operation with excellent prospects for success and minimal risk to our personnel." The transformation represented more than tactical improvement. It demonstrated how easily valuable expertise could be overlooked when assumptions about appearance and current role prevented recognition of actual capability. Harold's quiet competence had been present throughout the morning, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. General Thornfield stood and moved to the conference room's windows, his weathered face reflecting satisfaction with the morning's accomplishments. The Pentagon's corridors beyond the glass bustled with officers and civilians whose combined expertise shaped American military policy, though most would never receive recognition for their contributions. Harold remained focused on the tactical displays, his mind already considering potential adaptations that might be necessary if enemy forces had evolved beyond his historical understanding. Even the most effective tactics required continuous refinement based on operational results and changing battlefield conditions. The afternoon sun streamed through the Pentagon's conference room windows as the most successful tactical planning session in recent memory drew to its conclusion. Harold stood beside the tactical displays where his innovations had transformed an impossible mission into an achievable operation, his weathered face reflecting quiet satisfaction at knowledge finally recognized and applied. General Thornfield received the final confirmation from field commanders who had integrated Harold's tactical protocols into their operational procedures. Operation Midnight Eagle would proceed with confidence levels that had seemed impossible when a morning briefing began. The transformation was complete, measured not in revised casualty projections, but in the lives that would return home safely. Captain Rodriguez closed his comprehensive documentation of Harold's tactical insights, his tablet containing information that would reshape military doctrine for generations of future officers. "Sir," he said to Harold with obvious respect, "your contributions today extend far beyond a single mission. These principles will save lives in operations we can't yet imagine." Harold's response carried the humility of someone who had served without seeking recognition throughout his distinguished career. "That's the purpose of tactical innovation, Captain. Every lesson learned through experience should benefit the soldiers who follow. Knowledge serves its highest purpose when it protects those who serve." Lieutenant Walsh completed his analysis of how Harold's protocols had resolved every major tactical challenge they'd encountered during the morning's planning session. "Sergeant Vance," he announced to the room, "your innovations didn't just solve our current problems. They provided a framework for approaching similar challenges across multiple theaters of operation." The young lieutenant's recognition pleased Harold, who had always designed tactical approaches to be adaptable rather than specific to individual missions. Military excellence required principles that could evolve with changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental effectiveness across diverse operational environments. Major Patterson approached Harold with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal gratitude. "Sir," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this experience has changed how I'll approach every future interaction with fellow veterans. I'll never again assume that current role indicates historical capability or contribution." Harold appreciated Major Patterson's personal commitment to change, understanding that individual transformation often preceded institutional improvement. The Major's willingness to examine his own assumptions demonstrated the kind of leadership growth that strengthened military effectiveness across all levels of command. General Thornfield addressed the broader implications of the morning's discoveries as he prepared official recommendations for command leadership. This experience reveals critical gaps in how we identify and utilize expertise within our own ranks, he said to his assembled officers. "We need systematic changes to ensure valuable knowledge doesn't remain invisible due to assumptions about age or current assignment." The general's commitment to institutional reform represented exactly the kind of leadership Harold respected. Commanders who learned from mistakes and implemented improvements that benefited the entire military structure. Individual recognition mattered less than systematic changes that prevented similar oversights in future operations. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted his final operational summaries, his expression showing amazement at the dramatic transformation that had occurred during the extended briefing session. "Sir," he reported to General Thornfield, "we've reduced estimated casualties from 60% to less than 10%, while decreasing operational duration by more than half. This represents the most significant tactical breakthrough in recent memory." Harold's innovations had achieved exactly what military excellence should accomplish, transforming dangerous operations into manageable missions while preserving the lives of soldiers who trusted their commanders to make wise decisions. The human cost of military action always remained the most important consideration in tactical planning. Captain Morrison stood and faced Harold directly, his young face reflecting the gravity of lessons learned through the morning's revelations. "Sergeant Vance," he said formally, "I want to request permission to study your tactical innovations in detail. Your approaches represent military thinking that operates on a level I'm only beginning to understand." The request pleased Harold, who had always believed that tactical knowledge served its highest purpose when transmitted to subsequent generations of military leaders. Teaching these principles to young officers could prevent the casualties that resulted from repeatedly learning the same lessons through combat experience. General Thornfield moved to the conference room's portrait wall, his eyes settling on images of distinguished generals whose tactical innovations had shaped American military history. "Sergeant Vance," he said quietly, "your portrait belongs among these leaders. Your contributions to military doctrine equal those of any officer we honor in these halls." Harold's weathered face showed appreciation for the general's recognition, though he understood that true military honor came from service itself rather than formal acknowledgement. The soldiers who returned home safely because of tactical innovations represented the only recognition that truly mattered. Captain Rodriguez received confirmation that Harold's protocols had been distributed to tactical training centers throughout the military educational system. "Sir," he announced with excitement, "your innovations are already being integrated into advanced officer training programs. Future military leaders will learn these principles as fundamental doctrine rather than rediscovering them through trial and error." The integration of his tactical approaches into formal military education represented the culmination of Harold's career-long commitment to improving operational effectiveness. Knowledge that had been developed through dangerous missions would now protect soldiers who faced similar challenges in future conflicts. As this remarkable day comes to an end, I want to connect with all of you who followed Harold's incredible journey from dismissed coffee server to recognized tactical genius. If this story moved you, please drop a comment about your favorite moment or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when others underestimated them. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations where veterans or others weren't given the recognition they deserved. Your stories matter, and they help us remember to look beyond surface appearances to recognize the heroes who walk among us every day. The conference room began to empty as officers departed to implement the tactical innovations that would shape Operation Midnight Eagle's success. Harold remained beside the displays where his knowledge had finally found its proper application, his military bearing unchanged despite the transformation in how others perceived his contributions. General Thornfield was the last to leave, pausing beside Harold with an expression of deep respect mixed with institutional commitment. "Sergeant Vance," he said formally, "effective immediately, you're reassigned to the Pentagon's Tactical Innovation Division as Senior Strategic Advisor. Your expertise deserves recognition commensurate with its value to military operations." Harold's new assignment represented more than personal vindication. It symbolized institutional acknowledgement that experience and expertise could exist in unexpected forms. The military's willingness to recognize and utilize his knowledge demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that strengthened American defense capabilities. The empty conference room reflected the morning's transformation from dismissive assumptions to collaborative respect. The tactical displays still showed Harold's innovations, visual proof that valuable expertise had been present throughout the morning, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and listen to the answers. Harold's journey from invisible coffee server to recognized tactical advisor demonstrated that heroism often existed in quiet forms, requiring observation and respect rather than dramatic gestures for recognition. The morning's revelations had been possible only because one young captain had possessed the curiosity to look beyond surface appearances. The Pentagon's corridors buzzed with news of the tactical breakthrough that would reshape military doctrine for future operations. Harold's innovations would save lives in missions not yet planned, protecting soldiers whose names he would never know, but whose faces he could imagine with startling clarity. As evening approached, Harold prepared to leave the conference room, where his career had been transformed by recognition long overdue. The coffee cart remained beside the wall, a reminder of assumptions that had nearly cost the military access to invaluable tactical expertise. The day's lessons extended beyond individual recognition to encompass fundamental questions about how institutions identify and utilize the knowledge that exists within their own ranks. Harold's experience demonstrated that expertise often resided in unexpected places requiring only observation and respect for proper recognition.